Winning isn't everything. It's about the journey. It's about who you become along the way. It's about the relationships and the people that you get to share that journey with as well.
There's a moment in any art form when the work stops belonging to you, when the painting gets hung on the wall, when the film gets released, when the sculptor steps back from the marble. The thing you built has become an object in the world, and people look at it and they see what they want to see. For Chris Bumstead, that moment came every October, under the lights in Las Vegas, oiled up, trunks on, 6 years in a row. The crowd didn't see a man, they saw a statue. We don't usually talk about bodybuilding as an art form. We should. Think about what it actually is. A human being, using discipline and obsession and sacrifice and time, reshaping their physical form toward an ideal they carry in their mind. An ideal borrowed from mythology, from painting, from ancient sculpture. The greats, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Frank Zane, Lee Haney, they weren't just athletes. They were practitioners of a visual philosophy. The body as argument, the body as statement, the body as a kind of manifesto about what the human form could be if you were willing to suffer for it. Chris Bumstead understood this from the beginning, or at least he understood it before he could articulate it. He grew up in Ottawa, Canada. Standard story. Kid plays football, basketball, hockey. Gets introduced to the weight room at 14 by his brother-in-law, Ian Valliere, a seasoned IFBB pro. And something clicks. Between his freshman and senior years of high school, Bumstead goes from 170 pounds to 225. Not just stronger, transformed. But here's what's interesting about that transformation. The model he was working toward wasn't the modern bodybuilder, all mass and volume, almost grotesque in proportion. The men Chris idolized were Tom Platz, with his impossibly developed legs, Frank Zane, with his carved aesthetic lines, Arnold, who looked like someone had dreamed a man into existence. These were men who believed the body could be beautiful. Not just big, not just strong, beautiful. When the IFBB introduced the Classic Physique division in 2016, designed specifically to reward that aesthetic, old-school look, it felt almost like the sport had been waiting for Chris Bumstead. Or maybe Chris Bumstead had been waiting for it. He turned pro that same year. He was 21. There's a thing that happens when you're very good at something, and that something requires your entire self. The pursuit stops being a choice. It becomes an identity. An identity is the most dangerous thing in the world to build your life on, because it can be taken from you at any moment. By injury, by illness, by someone simply being better. Chris knew this. He just didn't know it yet. In 2017, he made his Olympia debut. He finished second. He went home and got back to work. In 2018, 4 weeks out from the Olympia, 4 weeks, he notices his legs are swelling. Not soreness, not inflammation from training. Something else. He ends up in the emergency room, spends 3 nights there. The diagnosis, IgA nephropathy, an autoimmune disease in which the immune system, instead of defending the body, begins attacking the kidneys. He was 23 years old. The disease is incurable. That word, incurable, lands differently when you're a professional athlete whose livelihood depends on your body performing at the absolute limit of human capability. The medications to manage the condition work by suppressing the immune system, which means Bumstead would spend the rest of his career competing while immunocompromised, requiring constant monitoring, living under a shadow that most of his fans couldn't see. He competed at that 2018 Olympia anyway. He finished second again. And here's the thing about that moment that I think gets overlooked. It wasn't bravery in the cinematic sense. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter and stranger. A man who had built his sense of self so completely around this singular pursuit that walking away, even when his body was literally attacking itself, wasn't something he could compute. The work was the wound. The wound was the work. He went back in 2019 and won. Then 2020. Then 2021. Then 2022. Then 2023. Then 2024. 6 consecutive Mr. Olympia Classic Physique titles. The longest winning streak in the history of the competition. But the story I want to tell isn't really about winning. There's a podcast Chris did Chris Williamson on Modern Wisdom right before his 6th title. And in it, Bumstead says something that stopped me cold. He talks about the internal voice, the one that comes for him even after 5 years of being the best in the world at what he does. He describes it this way: I have that voice in my head that will look at myself every now and then. Not like I'm a shitty person, but if I'm trying to be Mr. Olympia, you're not doing enough. And it creates an impeding anxiety upon myself. 5-time world champion, most popular active bodybuilder on the planet. More Instagram followers than almost anyone in the fitness space. And the voice still comes. He also says something else. Something that I think is more honest than most public figures allow themselves to be. Unwavering confidence is a lie. The fears never go away completely. They just don't linger as long. Read that again. The fears never go away completely. They just don't linger as long. This is the real texture of what it means to pursue mastery at the highest level. Not the highlights, not the trophy photos. The ambient anxiety that never fully quiets. The neuroticism that drives the perfectionism that produces the result that everyone else points to and calls confidence. There's a Jungian concept worth bringing in here. The concept of the persona. The mask we build for the external world. The version of ourselves that performs for the audience. Jung distinguished this sharply from the self. The actual, complicated, contradictory interior of a person. CBum, the brand, the physique, the champion, is a persona. Carefully constructed, incredibly powerful, and Chris Bumstead, the man who cries in the locker room before shows, who lives with an incurable kidney disease, who feels like he's not doing enough even at the top of the world. That's the self. Most people in the public eye spend their whole career protecting the persona from the self. What made Bumstead unusual, what made him connect with tens of millions of people, is that he sometimes let the self show the breakdown videos, the health disclosures, the honest interviews about doubt and fear. He let people see the crack in the marble. Bodybuilding is a sport that asks a specific question and demands a specific answer. The question is, how much are you willing to give? And the answer, for anyone who reaches the top, is always the same. Everything. But everything is a transaction. And transactions have terms. And the terms of this one aren't always spelled out in advance. Bumstead talks, in that same Modern Wisdom interview, about the pattern of his competitive years, what he calls the hero's journey of each prep cycle. Year after year, Olympia, hero's journey. Compete, come down, go through some type of adverse event, come through it again, win, high, back down, repeat, repeat. That's the actual experience of being an elite competitor, not the trophy moment, the cycle, the endless grinding cycle. And what happens to a person inside a cycle? They stop feeling, they stop processing. They get good at moving forward, because forward is the only direction that makes sense inside the loop. And all the things they don't process, the fear, the grief, the longing, the cost, those things accumulate somewhere in the body. After his retirement, Bumstead described the feeling of finally slowing down. He talked about being hypervigilant for years, subconsciously on alert, always scanning for the next threat, the next deficit, the next thing that needed to be improved. He described how that constant vigilance had become invisible to him because it was all he'd ever known. This is what peak performance costs, in a currency nobody talks about: the ability to be present to your own life. He won 6 Olympias and couldn't fully feel any of them, because feeling anything deeply would have made the next prep harder. That's not a failure. That's a feature of the machine. The machine that produces greatness. The machine that grinds through human experience in the service of the work. The tortured artist, in every form, lives inside that machine. Here's something that doesn't get examined enough about Chris Bumstead's cultural impact. He didn't just win a division, he defined what that division would mean. Classic Physique, before CBum, was a niche category within an already niche sport, a throwback aesthetic for purists. After CBum, it became arguably the most popular division in bodybuilding. His face became the face of the sport itself, not just for the hardcore fan base, but for millions of young men who'd never watched a bodybuilding competition in their lives. And why? Because he offered something the open division, with its distended stomachs and inhuman mass, couldn't offer. He offered an ideal that was aspirational rather than alien. Looking at Bumstead on stage, you don't feel the uncanny valley sensation that the biggest open division competitors sometimes produce. You feel something closer to wonder, the sense that a human body, properly trained, properly sculpted, can look like something out of a Greek frieze, like marble that learned to breathe. He modeled his physique consciously on the golden era, on Arnold and Zane, and the aesthetic philosophy of the 1970s Muscle Beach scene. But he did something those men couldn't do. He made it legible to the internet age. He brought the golden era into the era of algorithms and content cycles and 24 million follower Instagram accounts. And in doing so, he became the thing he had always revered. He became the ideal. There's a strange grief in that, if you're the person inside the ideal. Because the ideal isn't real. It lives on stage, under lights, for 90 seconds of posing. The rest of the time, you're just a person. A person with a kidney disease and a voice in your head telling you you're not doing enough, and a baby daughter who doesn't care how many Olympia trophies you have. Ronnie Coleman, 8-time Olympia winner, one of the greatest bodybuilders who ever lived, said about Bumstead, "I think Chris Bumstead is the greatest classic bodybuilder of all time. Absolutely the best physique I've ever seen in Classic Physique. Gotta be the best physique I've ever seen, period." When the greatest says something like that, you've arrived. You've become the thing you set out to become. But becoming the ideal is its own kind of loss. Because the ideal doesn't leave room for the man. In October 2024, in Las Vegas, Chris Bumstead walked on stage for the last time. He had told almost no one. He had let the rumors swirl. At the press conference days before, when asked directly about retirement, he deflected, not lying, just holding it close. One last time, he won. 6th consecutive title. The most in Classic Physique history. And then, with the trophy in his hand, he said the words, "I think a lot of people know what's coming today." The speech he gave was one of the most honest things I've heard from a public figure in that kind of moment. He didn't perform humility. He didn't run through a list of thank yous like he was accepting a Grammy. He talked about growth, about the mental and emotional journey of 8 years at the top. He said, "This is bittersweet. The last 8 years have been an incredible journey, and I've learned so much. But it's time for me to hand over the torch and embrace what lies beyond bodybuilding." And then he went and found his wife, Courtney King, herself a former Bikini Olympia champion, and his infant daughter, and held them. 6 months after retiring, he described what that stillness actually felt like from the inside. What I really found out about myself is that I constantly feel like I need to improve something. I need to progress something. I need to make my health better. And I was channeling that heavily into bodybuilding, which made me an incredible bodybuilder. But what once drove me started to drain me over time. Read that again. What once drove me started to drain me. That sentence is the architecture of every creative life. The obsession that builds the thing eventually becomes the thing that hollows you out. The wound that produces the work eventually needs to heal, or it starts costing you more than the work gives back. Walking away wasn't weakness. Walking away was the hardest discipline of his career. Knowing when the relationship with your craft has become extractive rather than generative, and choosing yourself anyway, that takes more courage than another prep cycle. Michelangelo is often quoted as saying that the sculpture already exists inside the marble, that the artist's job is simply to remove everything that isn't the statue. There's something in that idea that feels true about Chris Bumstead's life's work. He saw something in his mind, a version of the human body that nobody in modern competition had yet made real. And he spent a decade removing everything from his life that wasn't that vision. The comfort, the excess, the middle ground, the forgiveness. He produced the statue. But statues can't feel. Statues don't doubt. Statues don't lie in a hospital bed 4 weeks before the biggest show of their lives, wondering if the body they've built their identity around is about to betray them entirely. The man behind the marble did all of those things. And what I find remarkable about Chris Bumstead, what makes him worth an essay on a channel called Tortured Artists Club, is that he understood the difference. Eventually, not always, and not without cost. But he understood that the statue was never the point. The point was the man who made it. The man who kept making it, even when his immune system was working against him. Even when the voice in his head told him he wasn't enough. Even when the winds kept coming, and the inside kept aching, and the cycle kept grinding. That man, the one the statue was hiding, walked away, and he took his daughter, and his wife, and whatever's left of himself after a decade of total devotion, and he went looking for what comes next. That's the work that doesn't get photographed. That's the Olympia nobody gives a trophy for. But in its way, it might be the most important thing he's ever built.